The man rode into Dusty Creek, Texas on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1873, with nothing but a name that sounded like it belonged to a poet and a bay mare that looked like she had seen every hard mile between the Mississippi River and the Rio Grande. Edgar Walden pulled his horse to a slow stop at the edge of the main road, and he took in the town with the careful, measuring eyes of a man who had learned long ago that a place could turn on you without warning. Dusty Creek was not much to look at. A general store, a livery stable, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church with peeling white paint, a schoolhouse, and a scattering of homes that spread out toward the flat, golden plains like a hand reaching for something just beyond its grasp. The sky above was enormous, the kind of sky that makes a man feel both very small and very free at the same time, and the afternoon light was the color of warm honey poured over rust. He had ridden from Missouri. Before that, he had been in Kansas for a short while, and before that, Kentucky, where he had been born on a farm that no longer existed, to parents who no longer lived. He was 28 years old and had been drifting for the better part of 4 years, not because he was running from anything in particular, but because he had never found a reason sufficient enough to make him stop. He clicked his tongue and urged the mare forward, her hooves sending up small puffs of dry dust with every step. The road was well worn and hard, and the smell of the town drifted toward him on the breeze, wood smoke and horse and something baking, something sweet, something that made his stomach respond immediately because he had not eaten since the morning before. He tied the mare outside the general store and stepped inside, his spurs making a soft sound against the plank floor. The interior was dim and cool, and it smelled of leather and tobacco and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A man behind the counter with a red mustache and round spectacles looked up from his ledger with the kind of neutral expression that frontier shopkeepers had perfected over generations, friendly enough to encourage commerce, guarded enough to discourage trouble. "Afternoon," Edgar said, touching the brim of his hat. "I am looking for work, any kind. I can shoe horses, I can build fence, I can drive cattle. I am good with my hands and I do not cause problems." The man behind the counter, whose name Edgar would later learn was Harold Finch, studied him for a moment with the careful appraisal that men in small western towns applied to strangers. Edgar was tall, lean from hard travel, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed shaving, but his eyes were steady and clear, and his clothing, though worn, was clean. He did not have the restless, flickering quality of a man with something to hide. "Name," Harold said. "Edgar Walden." Harold chewed on the name the way he might chew on something he was not sure he trusted. "You passing through, Mr. Walden, or are you looking to settle?" "That depends on whether there is something worth settling for," Edgar said honestly. Harold set his pen down and leaned on the counter. "There is a woman by the name of Conley, lives about 3 miles east on the Conley spread. She has been trying to run that place alone since her husband passed near 8 months ago. She has been asking around for reliable help and finding precious little of it. Man who worked for her last left in June. I would not say it is an easy job, but it is honest work and she pays fair." Edgar absorbed this. "She runs the place alone. She and her daughter Clara. Clara is 11, Mrs. Conley is tough as cedar wood, but that land does not work itself, and winter is coming on. She needs somebody who knows what they are doing." Edgar nodded slowly. "How do I find her?" Harold drew him a map on the back of a piece of wrapping paper, and Edgar thanked him and bought a tin of beans and a small loaf of bread, which he ate sitting on the porch of the general store while his mare drank from the trough beside the hitching post. He watched the town move around him. A woman in a blue dress crossing the road, 2 old men playing checkers outside the barber shop, a dog sleeping in a patch of sun. He ate slowly and he thought about what Harold had told him, and something about it settled in his chest like a coal beginning to glow. He left within the hour. The Conley property came into view as the sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the western horizon, and the sight of it made Edgar sit up straighter in the saddle. It was a working ranch. modest but solid, with a farmhouse built from good timber, a barn that needed some attention on its eastern wall, 2 paddocks, and a stretch of fenced pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed in the golden light. There was a kitchen garden to one side of the house, and a line of washing strung between 2 posts, shirts and aprons and a small child's dress swaying in the evening breeze. And there was a woman in the paddock. She was working alone, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to save every unnecessary motion, because unnecessary motions cost time and time was currency she could not afford to waste. She was mending a section of fence rail that had come loose, using a hammer with steady, competent blows, her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed straw hat. She wore a plain cotton dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a leather work apron over it, and she worked the way people work when they have forgotten that anyone might be watching, with complete unself-conscious focus. Edgar stopped his mare at the gate and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am." She did not startle. She looked up with the directness of a woman who had learned that hesitation was a luxury, and she assessed him with brown eyes that were direct and careful and missed very little. She was perhaps 25, he thought, with a face that was pretty in the way that practical things can be pretty, without any unnecessary ornamentation, with a quality of character in it that made it more interesting the longer you looked. "You are on my land," she said. It was not hostile, simply factual. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for arriving without notice. My name is Edgar Walden. Harold Finch at the general store mentioned you might be in need of a hired hand. I am looking for work." She rested the hammer against the fence rail and looked at him steadily. "What kind of work can you do?" "I can do most things that need doing on a cattle ranch. I was raised on a farm in Kentucky, and I have spent the last 4 years working various spreads across Kansas and Missouri. I can shoe horses, repair structures, manage cattle, drive fence posts, work a harness, mend tack, plant and harvest if the season requires it. I am hardworking, and I do not drink on the job, and I do not start trouble." "Do you finish trouble if someone else starts it?" The question was asked with a kind of blunt, practical seriousness, and he answered it the same way. "If it is necessary to protect life or property, yes. But I have found that most trouble is avoidable with a cool head." She pulled a loose strand of hair from her face and tucked it back under the brim of her hat. "I have a daughter," she said. "She is 11 years old. She lives here with me. Anyone who works this land is held to the standard of conduct appropriate to a home where a child is present. Is that understood?" "Completely, ma'am. I pay fair wages, $12 a month with meals included, and there is a room in the barn that is serviceable. It is not fancy, but it is dry and warm." She paused. "I am not in a position to hire someone and then find in 2 weeks that they have decided to move on. If you take this position, I need a commitment through at least the winter, through March. After that, we can discuss terms going forward." "Through March and beyond, if the arrangement suits us both," Edgar said. She looked at him for another long moment, and he had the feeling she was reading him the way experienced people read weather, looking not at what was immediately visible but at what was beneath it, at the quality and direction of the thing. "I am Letitia Conley," she said, and she extended her hand the way a rancher extends a hand, not in the delicate manner of a social introduction, but in the direct, firm way of a business proposition. He stepped down from the mare and came to the fence and shook it. Her grip was strong and her palm was calloused and warm. "It is good to meet you, Mrs. Conley. Come around to the barn. I will show you where you will be sleeping, and then I would like you to have a look at the east wall. I have been patching it myself, but I cannot get the framing right, and I believe there is a structural issue I am not equipped to address." "Yes, ma'am." He led his mare through the gate and followed Letitia Conley across her property in the amber evening light, and something in him that had been wound tight and restless for 4 years began, very tentatively, to ease. The barn room was small, but she had not exaggerated when she said it was serviceable. There was a cot with a decent blanket, a small wood stove in the corner, a shelf for personal items, a lantern, and a hook on the wall for a coat. Edgar set his saddlebag on the cot and looked around and felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, something that resembled the distant echo of home. He spent the last hour of daylight examining the east wall of the barn. The problem was exactly what she had suspected. A section of framing had rotted at the base and was pulling away from the main structure. He told her what needed to be done, what lumber he would require, and she listened without interrupting and then told him she would send word to the mill in Dusty Creek and have the lumber delivered by the end of the week. "You seem to know what you are looking at," she said. "I have fixed this problem before," he said. "It is common when drainage is not managed well on the windward side of a barn." She nodded. "My husband meant to address it. He did not get the chance." She said it without apparent emotion, but he heard something underneath it, the flat, particular exhaustion of grief that has been compressed into practical daily living because there is no alternative. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you." She turned toward the house. "Supper is at 6. Clara will ring the bell." He was at the table precisely when the bell rang, having washed his face and hands at the pump behind the barn and done what he could with his hair. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and something that turned out to be a venison stew with root vegetables. And Clara Conley sat at the table with the self-possessed watchfulness of a child who had learned early to take the measure of adults. She was 11, as her mother had said, with her mother's dark eyes and a scattering of freckles across her nose, and she looked at Edgar with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. "Are you a real cowboy?" she asked before her mother could introduce them. "Clara," Letitia said without heat. "It is all right," Edgar said. He looked at Clara seriously. "I have worked cattle. Whether that makes me a real cowboy is a matter of definition. I have ridden more miles than I care to count, and I have mended more fence than I thought one man could mend in a lifetime, and I have slept under more open skies than I have slept under roofs. I suppose that is something like a cowboy." Clara considered this with the gravity of someone weighing testimony. "Do you know how to rope?" "I do." "Will you show me?" "Clara," Letitia said again, more firmly this time. "If your mother permits it," Edgar said, "I would be glad to." Clara looked at her mother with transparent hopefulness, and Letitia set the bread on the table with the air of someone choosing her battles. "Eat your supper first," she said. They ate, and Edgar learned that Clara was clever and forthright, and already knew a great deal about the working of the ranch, more than most children her age would have known, because she had been helping her mother since her father's death in the way that children on frontier properties help, seriously and with real contribution. He learned that Letitia's husband, Robert Conley, had died of a fever in the previous winter, a quick and brutal ending to what had apparently been a healthy and capable man, and that Letitia had been managing the ranch since then with help from neighboring families where it was offered, and with her own considerable determination where it was not. He also learned, over that first supper and over many suppers that followed, that Letitia Conley was not a woman given to unnecessary words. She spoke when she had something to say, and she listened with genuine attention when other people spoke, and she had opinions that were considered and clearly reasoned, and she was not afraid to disagree when she disagreed. She was also, he noticed, privately funny, in a dry and restrained way that occasionally broke through her practicality in small, unexpected flashes that made him want to see it happen again. The first weeks settled into a rhythm. Edgar rose before dawn and worked until dark, and there was no shortage of things to work on. The barn wall was repaired once the lumber arrived, and after it he turned his attention to the paddock fences, then to the roof of the equipment shed, then to the cattle, which needed their herd health attended to after a summer that had been harder than expected. He worked with the quiet competence of a man who knew his craft deeply and did not need direction beyond an initial conversation, and he observed that this was something Letitia appreciated, because she had enough to manage without having to supervise someone else's every move. She rose early and worked late, and the work she did was real, not the token effort of someone performing adequacy, but the full and genuine labor of someone keeping a living enterprise alive. She managed the accounts and the correspondence. She worked the kitchen garden. She oversaw the cattle operation. She maintained the house. She ensured Clara attended the schoolhouse in Dusty Creek 3 days a week. She managed relationships with neighboring ranchers and with the merchants in town. And she did all of it with an efficiency that Edgar found increasingly remarkable the more he understood the scope of what she was managing. He found himself watching her sometimes, with the particular kind of attention that begins before a person realizes it is happening. He noticed the way she tucked her hair back with an absent gesture when she was concentrating, the way she laughed at Clara's stories with a warmth that transformed her face entirely, the way she stood at the fence in the evening sometimes, looking out over her land with an expression that was part possession and part communion, as though the land belonged to her and she belonged to it in equal measure. He did not think about it too directly. He was employed. She was his employer. She was a widow, less than a year from her husband's death. He was a man who had chosen not to put down roots for so long that he had nearly forgotten the desire. He kept his thoughts disciplined and his conduct appropriate, and he worked as hard as he knew how to work, which was very hard indeed. But things have their own gravity, and the pull between two people who are spending long days in proximity, doing difficult work, sharing meals, sharing concern for the same child, facing the same problems and solving them together, is not a thing that is easily resisted simply because it is acknowledged as inadvisable. The first real shift happened in October. There was a morning when a section of the pasture fence came down in the night, a long section, nearly 40 yards of it, probably damaged by a dry autumn storm that had passed through in the dark hours. And by the time Edgar discovered it, at first light 3 of the cattle had wandered onto the open plain. He saddled the mare immediately and went after them, and he was 2 miles out in the cold gray pre-dawn when he realized that Letitia had come after him on her own horse, a steady gray gelding she called Pepper, to help work the cattle back. They moved the cattle together with the efficient shorthand of people who have been working the same land long enough to anticipate each other's movements, and it took about an hour to get the 3 animals back through the gap and into the pasture. The sun was fully up by then, thin and pale, with the serious cold of October in it, and they both stood at the fence line and caught their breath in small white clouds. "You did not have to come," Edgar said. "It is my cattle," she said simply. He looked at her sideways. Her cheeks were red from the cold and the ride, and there was a strand of dark hair across her face, and she was looking at the cattle with the satisfied expression of a job completed, and something in his chest ached with a kind of warmth that he recognized with alarm as the early movement of genuine feeling. He looked away. "We will need the post-hole digger and about a dozen posts to fix this properly. I can get started this morning." "I will help," she said. "Clara is at school. I am not needed at the house." They worked side by side all morning, and by noon they had the fence repaired and reinforced. And when Letitia brought out a canteen of water and handed it to him and their fingers overlapped briefly on the tin, and she looked at him directly for just a moment before she looked away, he knew, with the certainty of a man reading weather, that the warmth was not entirely one-directional. But neither of them said anything. They went back to work. October deepened into November and the cold came down off the plains with real intent, and the work shifted to winter preparation. Laying in feed and firewood, checking the cattle for health, winterizing the structures, making sure the equipment was in good repair before the ground froze hard. Edgar worked with increasing investment in the outcome, not simply because he was being paid, but because he had begun to care about the ranch in a way that surprised him, about the health of the cattle and the soundness of the buildings and the state of the winter stores, as though the well-being of this place had somehow become personally important to him. He spent his evenings in his room in the barn, reading when he had something to read, or sitting by his small stove in the particular quiet contentment of physical exhaustion after honest labor, and he thought about things he had not thought about for a long time. About permanence. About what it would mean to stay somewhere, not just through the winter as he had promised, but past that, into the spring and the summer and the seasons that followed. About what it would mean to build something, rather than simply passing through other people's buildings. He thought about Letitia Conley, who woke up every morning and faced an enormous task alone, and did not flinch from it, and who had brown eyes that were direct and warm in equal measure, and who occasionally said something so quietly amusing that he laughed before he meant to, and who stood at her fence in the evenings like she owned the sky as well as the land beneath it. He thought about her in the careful, contained way that a man thinks about something he is not sure he is permitted to want. The conversation that changed things between them happened on a cold evening in late November, when Clara had gone to bed early with a head cold, and the house was quiet, and Letitia came out to the barn with a covered dish of stew, because she said she had made too much and it would go to waste otherwise. He thanked her, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of the barn room as though she intended to leave, and then instead she sat down on the chair near the wood stove, and he sat on the cot and they talked. They talked for 3 hours. About his life before the frontier, about the farm in Kentucky and his parents, and the years after they died, when he had been 17 and entirely alone for the first time. About what it had felt like to choose movement over stillness as a way of managing loss. About her marriage to Robert Conley, which had been a good marriage, a partnership between two practical and affectionate people, and about his death, which had come so fast and been so complete that she had not yet fully absorbed it 8 months later. About Clara, who was the bravest small person she had ever encountered, and who terrified her with the intensity of how much she loved her. About what they both thought the frontier was, and what it demanded of the people who chose it or were chosen by it. At some point the stew was eaten and the fire needed wood, and Edgar added a log and sat back down, and the conversation went on, quieter now, with the intimacy that late hours produce in shared, enclosed warmth. And at some point Letitia said, with a kind of deliberate care, as though she had been working up to it, "Do you think you will move on in the spring, Edgar?" It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at the fire for a moment. "I said through March," he said, "but I said beyond that if the arrangement suits us both." He looked at her. "I find that it suits me." She held his gaze for a moment. "I find that it suits me as well," she said. It was not a declaration of anything. It was not an embrace or a kiss or any kind of romantic gesture. It was two careful, sensible people acknowledging, with the precision of people who do not use words carelessly, that what had grown between them in those weeks of shared labor and shared meals and shared concern for the same child and the same land was real and was worth something. "Good," Edgar said. "Good," Letitia agreed. She went back to the house. He sat by the fire for a long time, not thinking anything very coherently, just feeling the warmth of it, the particular warmth that is not from burning wood. December arrived with a ferocity that Letitia told him was unusual even by Texas standards. A hard freeze came through in the second week of the month, and they lost 2 calves, which was a genuine blow to the herd numbers and the spring income she was counting on. He watched her absorb it, standing in the frozen pasture in the early morning light, and he saw the grief of it move across her face briefly, the grief that was not just about the calves but about all of it, the weight of the whole precarious enterprise. And then she squared her shoulders and said, "We need to move the rest of the herd closer to the barn. The south paddock will be better sheltered." He moved the cattle. She organized the additional feed. Together they got the herd through the worst of the freeze, and when it broke a week later and the surviving animals were all present and healthy, Letitia looked at him over the fence rail in the early afternoon light and said, "I could not have done this without you," with such simple directness that he felt it like a hand pressed against his heart. "You could have," he said, "but I am glad you did not have to." She smiled at him then, really smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rewrites whatever you thought you understood about a person's face. Christmas came to the Conley ranch quietly. Letitia made a proper Christmas dinner, roast chicken and sweet potatoes, and a dried apple pie that Clara helped with, proudly, and with flour on her nose. Edgar contributed a small cedar tree he cut from the creek bottom and stood in the corner of the parlor, and Clara decorated it with ribbon and paper stars she made herself. It was the most genuine Christmas Edgar had experienced since his parents had been alive, and he sat at the table in the warm kitchen with the two Conley women and felt something break open in him very quietly, like a lock finding the right key. After supper, Clara fell asleep in the parlor chair, and Letitia covered her with a quilt, and they sat together at the kitchen table with cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of people who have earned the right to be quiet together. And at some point Letitia said, looking at her coffee cup, "Robert proposed to me at Christmas. He came to my father's house with a ring he had made from a silver coin because he could not afford a proper ring, and he asked me in the most serious and awkward way imaginable, and I thought I would die of tenderness for him." Edgar listened. "I have not talked about him much," she said. "I find it easier to carry things than to set them down and look at them." "That is understandable," he said. "But I think I am beginning to set this one down," she said, and she raised her eyes and looked at him with a directness that made his breath slow. "I do not know if that is too soon or not soon enough. I genuinely do not know, but I think it is where I am." He was very still. "I am in no hurry," he said carefully. "I am not going anywhere." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "That is part of what makes it possible to say." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, not urgently, not with any particular demand, simply with the clear and steady warmth of someone who meant to be there, and she turned her hand palm up and held his, and they stayed that way for a while in the lamplight while Clara slept in the parlor and the Texas winter pressed against the windows. That was Christmas of 1873. The new year brought a change in the quality of everything. Not dramatic or sudden, but real in the way that seasons change, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small, unmistakable evidences. The way Edgar brought her coffee in the morning when he came in from the early chores, because he had learned exactly how she took it. The way she saved the best apple from the cellar for him without thinking about it, and then was briefly self-conscious about it when she noticed what she had done. The way they stood together at the fence in the evenings now, shoulder to shoulder, talking about the next day's work or sometimes not talking at all, just standing in the same direction together. Clara noticed. Clara was 11 and sharp, and she noticed everything. She did not say anything directly, but she began treating Edgar with a subtle shift, a proprietary quality, as though he was graduating from employee to something she did not have an exact word for but understood in the way children understand things that adults are still working out. In January, there was an incident with a man named Denton Price. Price owned the neighboring ranch to the north, a larger operation that had been making small encroachments on the Conley land since Robert's death. Nothing dramatic enough to constitute outright theft, but a steady, quiet pressure that Letitia had been resisting through careful documentation and firm communication. Price was not a violent man, but he was a man who operated in the assumption that a woman alone was negotiable, that her property was something that could be worn down and absorbed in due time. He rode onto the Conley property one January morning without invitation, while Edgar was working in the south paddock, and he went directly to Letitia at the kitchen garden where she was turning winter soil, and he made her an offer for the ranch. A low offer. An insulting offer, one that treated the land as already distressed property, as though her tenure of it were a formality that he was politely waiting to expire. Edgar came around the corner of the barn and saw the exchange from a distance. He could see by Letitia's posture that she was not in distress. She was angry, which was different, and he made a deliberate choice. He walked toward them at a normal pace, not aggressive, and he arrived at Letitia's side and stood there and said nothing, simply stood with her, the way you stand with someone when you mean to make clear that they are not standing alone. Price looked at him with assessment. "This the man you hired," he said to Letitia, as though Edgar were not present. "This is Edgar Walden, Letitia said, with a coolness that was something to behold. "He is a partner in the management of this ranch. And my answer to your offer is the same as my answer has been every time you have made some version of it. This land is not for sale. Not at any price. Not under any circumstance. If you put your fence stakes on my land again, I will pull them up and send them to you through the county land office with a formal complaint. Now I have work to do." Price looked at Edgar with the calculating hostility of a man being blocked by someone he had not accounted for in his calculations. Edgar met his gaze with the patient steadiness of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove and no intention of backing up. After a moment, Price turned his horse and left. When he was gone, Letitia let out a long breath and her shoulders dropped slightly with the release of it. "I despise that man," she said, without particular venom, simply as a factual statement. "He will try again," Edgar said. "I know, but he will not succeed." She looked at Edgar with something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "Thank you for coming when you did." "I was not going to interfere," he said. "You were managing it." "I know," she said. "That is also something to be thankful for." She had called him a partner in the management of the ranch, and she had said it so naturally, so without apparent calculation, that he spent part of the afternoon thinking about it, about whether she had meant it precisely or had simply found the word that served the moment. By supper he had decided that with Letitia Conley there was very little distance between words and precision. In February, the weather broke into a false spring. Several days of warmth so genuine and fragrant that Clara went outside in the afternoons without a coat and ran around the paddock in the peculiar way children run when they have been enclosed too long, with their arms wide and their faces turned up. Edgar watched her from the fence rail and found himself smiling in a way that was not about work or strategy or any practical consideration, simply about the pure and unreasonable joy of watching a child run in February sunshine. Letitia appeared beside him. "She is so much better when she can be outside," she said. "Most people are," he said. They stood watching Clara for a moment. Then Letitia said, "She likes you very much. She would not like you if she did not trust you." "She is particular about who she trusts. She is a good judge of character," Edgar said. "I hope her judgment is correct in this case." Letitia looked at him with a kind of quiet intensity that he was beginning to know, that gathering of focus that preceded something she had decided to say. "Edgar," she said, "yes, I think you know what is happening between us." He kept his eyes on Clara. "I think so," he said carefully. "I want to say it plainly," she said, "because I find that plain speech prevents misunderstanding and I have come to value you far too much to risk misunderstanding." She paused. "I have developed feelings for you that go well beyond gratitude for your work, and well beyond the ordinary affection of people who are living and working in the same place. I believe you feel something similar. I may be wrong, and if I am wrong I would rather know it directly than carry on in uncertainty." He turned to look at her fully. She was looking at him with those direct brown eyes, unflinching, but he could see the vulnerability in it, the courage it had taken to set the words down plainly like that, because she was not naturally a woman who placed herself at risk of refusal. "You are not wrong," he said. "Not even a little bit wrong." Something in her face shifted, a small, quiet loosening. "Good," she said, and then she laughed a little, the soft, surprised laugh of someone relieved. "Good." "Good," he agreed, and he smiled at her, and she smiled back, and Clara chose that exact moment to notice them standing at the fence smiling at each other and called out, "What are you two doing?" in the suspicious and delighted voice of a child who suspects she is witnessing something significant. "Looking at the pasture," Letitia called back, perfectly composed. Clara looked entirely unconvinced. That evening, after Clara was in bed, they sat together on the porch in the mild February air, and for the first time he kissed her, not with any urgency, but with the particular tenderness of something long gathered and finally given permission. And she put her hand against his jaw and kissed him back with all the warmth that she kept controlled in the ordinary hours of ordinary days. And the night was soft and enormous around them, and the stars over the Texas plain were incomprehensible in their number. She pulled back after a while and looked at him in the dark. "I have been trying very hard not to feel this," she said. "I know," he said. "So have I. I am not trying anymore," she said. "Neither am I." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the dark for a long time, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, and something in Edgar Walden that had been wandering for 4 years sat down very quietly and decided it had arrived. March came and went, and Edgar did not go anywhere. He did not go anywhere in April either, when the spring came on with the full force of the Texas plains, the wildflowers coming up between the grasses, the cattle growing fat and restless, the days lengthening into gold and the nights into something vast and full of sound. He did not go anywhere in May, when the spring work was at its most demanding and they drove the cattle to the east pasture and the days were long and dusty and satisfying. He was there. He intended to stay there, but there were practical matters to address. He was a hired hand sleeping in the barn, and she was the widow of the man who had built the house, and between those two realities was a distance that, in 1874 Texas, could not simply be ignored. There were social structures and expectations, and the welfare of a child to consider, and he was not a man who thought lightly about the responsibilities that come with seriousness of intention. On an evening in early May, he asked her to walk with him to the high ground at the eastern edge of her property, a rise that looked out over the whole of the Conley land, the cattle in the long pasture, the house and barn and garden below, the distant line of Dusty Creek on the horizon. The sky was doing something magnificent in the west, stacking up in layers of orange and red and deep purple, the kind of sky that makes argument seem beside the point. He had thought about what he was going to say for quite some time. He did not want to be clumsy about it. He also did not want to be elaborate in a way that would seem performative to a woman who valued plain speech. "I have been thinking," he said, looking at the view, "about what I want." She stood beside him, close, their arms touching, and she said, "I want to stay here," he said, "not as a hired hand, not as something temporary that suits the season. I want to stay here permanently in every sense that word carries." He turned to face her. "I want to marry you, Letitia. I want to help you build this ranch into what you always meant it to be. I want to be a father to Clara if she will have me. I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine in the complete and permanent way." He paused. "I do not have a ring. I apologize for that. I have $12 and change and a horse, and what I am offering is the rest of my life and all the labor in it." She looked at him for a long moment, and the sky went on doing its magnificent work behind him, and a single tear slid down her face, which surprised them both, because she was not a crying woman, and she said, $12 and a horse and the rest of your life is considerably more than I expected when Harold Finch sent a stranger to my fence. Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a very clear yes," she said. He took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and she held onto the front of his shirt with both fists, and the sunset behind them went on burning like the answer to something very old. They told Clara over supper. Letitia told her in the simple, direct way she told Clara important things, without softening or elaborating, just the facts of it. Edgar had asked to marry her, and she had said yes, and this was going to mean that Edgar would be part of their family in a permanent way. She watched Clara's face carefully as she spoke. Clara was quiet for a moment, which was unlike her. Then she looked at Edgar with those dark, assessing eyes. "If you marry my mother," she said, "does that make you my father?" Edgar met her gaze directly. "That is what I would hope," he said. "If it is what you want, you do not have to call me father or think of me that way if it does not feel right. Your father was a real man who loved you and built this place for you, and I will never pretend otherwise. But I would be honored to be part of your life in whatever way you are comfortable with." Clara was quiet for another moment. Then she said, with the decisive air of someone who has made up their mind, "I think I would like to call you Papa, if that is acceptable." "It is the most acceptable thing anyone has ever said to me," Edgar said, with a steadiness in his voice that was harder to maintain than he would have liked. Clara nodded as though this were now settled business and reached for the bread. "Good. When is supper ready? I am very hungry." Letitia laughed, the full warm laugh that she rarely let out, and Edgar laughed with her, and Clara looked between them with the satisfied expression of a child who has accomplished something she was aiming for. They were married in June. The wedding was held at the church in Dusty Creek on a Saturday morning, with Harold Finch and his wife as witnesses, and Clara as a very serious maid of honor in a white dress that Letitia had made in the evenings over 3 weeks. The minister, a quiet man named Reverend Holt, performed the ceremony with gentle sincerity, and about 20 of the town's residents attended, because Letitia Conley was known and respected, and people wanted to see her happy. Edgar stood at the front of that church in the best shirt he owned, which Letitia had pressed for him the night before, and he watched her walk down the aisle on Clara's arm, because Clara had insisted on this and Letitia had seen no reason to argue, and the sight of the two of them coming toward him, the tall woman with the dark eyes and the straight-backed girl with the freckled nose, both of them smiling, hit him somewhere so deep and central that he had to remind himself to breathe. He had come to the frontier with nothing but a name and a horse, and here she was, walking toward him with her daughter at her side and her land behind her and her whole life ahead of her. And he understood with the kind of bone-deep certainty that does not require examination that this was the reason. That he had been moving all those years not because he was lost but because he had not yet arrived, and arriving looked like this. Like a woman in a blue dress coming toward him in a small Texas church, while the morning sun came through the windows and fell across the floor in long gold bars. "I do," she said, when the time came, looking at him with her steady, direct eyes. "I do," he said, and he meant it in every possible dimension of the phrase. They put a ring on her finger, a simple silver band that Edgar had commissioned from the jeweler in Dusty Creek for $3.50, which was more than he could easily afford, and she looked at it on her hand with an expression that made the cost irrelevant. After the ceremony, the town of Dusty Creek more or less took over. Someone had organized a gathering outside the church, tables set up with food that various women had contributed, and there was a fiddle player and a guitar. And the afternoon became the kind of afternoon that is more life than occasion, warm and sprawling and full of laughter, children running between the tables and old men talking about crops, Clara holding court with the other children with the authority of someone who considers herself a person of significance in the day's events. Edgar danced with Letitia. He was not particularly skilled at dancing, but she was patient with him, and they moved together in the afternoon sunlight to the fiddle music, and she said against his ear, "You are going to step on my foot again." And he said, "Probably," and she laughed and held on. He also had a conversation that afternoon that he would think about for a long time afterward. One of the women at the gathering, a Mrs. Caldwell from the north edge of town, took him aside with the particular manner of a woman who considers it her social duty to dispense wisdom to those who require it. And she said, with genuine sincerity, "You understand, Mr. Walden, that what you have taken on is considerable. That woman has held this together alone through the worst year of her life. She deserves a man who understands what that cost her." "I understand it," Edgar said. "I hope you do," Mrs. Caldwell said, and she looked at him for a moment and then she nodded. "I believe you might," she said, and she went back to the tables. He moved into the house that evening, his modest collection of belongings carrying from the barn room without ceremony. Clara showed him which room was which, and which hooks were for which coats, and which drawer in the kitchen contained the extra candles, with the proprietary authority of a child showing an adult the correct way to inhabit a space she considers her domain. The summer of 1874 was the best summer Edgar Walden had spent in his adult life, which he recognized was not a low bar he was clearing, but a genuine statement about quality. The ranch operated at full capacity for the first time since Robert Conley's illness had begun to take the edge off his ability to run it at its best, and the cattle herd grew, and the pastures were managed well, and the south fence that had been causing problems for 3 seasons was finally rebuilt from the posts up. They also addressed the situation with Denton Price in a permanent way. With Edgar present in a formal capacity, and with a carefully written letter from Letitia to the county land office establishing the precise boundaries of the Conley property, and with a visit from the county surveyor that Edgar had arranged and paid for out of his wages, the encroachment issue was resolved officially and documented in the county records. Price, faced with documentation he could not argue with and a man who was clearly neither leaving nor backing down, ceased his advances on the Conley land permanently. He was not gracious about it, but he was final about it, and that was all that mattered. Life found its level, the good level, the one that is not drama or crisis, but simply the deep, textured satisfaction of a life being built day by day with intention and care. They worked side by side, which they always had, but now with the added dimension of going inside together at the end of the day, of sharing a table and a hearth and a room, of waking in the same morning light and making coffee together, and talking about the day ahead in the comfortable shorthand of people who know each other's mind. He learned her more deeply in those months. He learned that she had a tendency, when she was worried, to reorganize the kitchen, and that this was a reliable indicator of internal stress that she might not express directly. He learned that she read seriously, and that she had a collection of books she had carried from her parents' home in Tennessee, and that she read in the evenings when the day's work was done, and that she was willing to read aloud to him, which he found he loved. He learned that she had a slight, barely audible laugh when something surprised her, very different from her full laugh, more unguarded, and that this was the version he worked most consistently to produce. She learned him, too. She learned that he woke with a particular clarity in the mornings that was different from his more complicated moods later in the day, and that if she wanted his best thoughts on anything important, morning was the time to ask. She learned that he had a deep and private attachment to his horse, the bay mare whose name was Bess, and that he cared for the animal with a tenderness that he applied to very few things, and that this tenderness was revealing about him. She learned that he could be lonely for his past, for his parents, for the Kentucky farm that existed only in his memory now, and that on these evenings he was quieter and needed companionship more than conversation, and she gave him that without requiring him to explain. In September, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, over coffee, in the plain and direct way she told him everything important. She watched his face as she said it, reading his reaction with those attentive eyes, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up and went around the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with something that was not quite containable in ordinary expression, something that was joy and gratitude and a kind of enormous tenderness that had no precise name. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "They have," he said, "and I intend to be considerably more useful than most of the men who have been adjacent to the process." She laughed, the real laugh, the full one. "I have no doubt of that," she said. They told Clara that afternoon. Clara received the information with a brief, considering silence and then said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Letitia said. Clara thought about this. "I think a boy would be interesting," she said judiciously. "I have always been curious what boys are actually like from close up." Edgar pressed his lips together to maintain his composure. "That is a very scientific approach to the matter," he said. "I am a very practical person," Clara said, in a tone that was so precisely her mother's that Letitia had to look away. The pregnancy progressed normally through the autumn and winter. Edgar was attentive without being suffocating, which was something Letitia appreciated more than she could have articulated, because being treated as an invalid would have been intolerable to her, and he knew it. He adjusted the work he expected of her without making it a conversation, simply absorbing more of the physical labor and making sure things were managed before she had to think about them. And she let him do this because it was practical, and because she loved him for doing it. They had conversations in those months, long conversations, about the future of the ranch and what they meant to build together, about Clara's education and what her options might be, about the kind of place Dusty Creek was becoming and what part they might play in it. There was a school board forming, and Letitia had opinions about the curriculum and the land for the new schoolhouse, and Edgar found that attending these civic concerns alongside her was something that engaged him genuinely. He was, he discovered, a man who had opinions about the kind of community he wanted to live in, and he had simply never had the occasion to express them, because he had never lived anywhere long enough for community to matter. He also, in the winter of 1874, wrote a letter to the Territory Land Office about a matter that had been nagging at him since he arrived in the county. There was a band of Comanche people who had been pushed off land that had been theirs, displaced by the encroachment of settlers and cattle operations, and whose situation, which was one of real hardship and genuine injustice, was something that the county tended to discuss in terms of its own convenience rather than in terms of what was fair. Edgar's letter did not change the broad facts of the situation, which were grim and deep-rooted, and would take more than a letter to address. But it was a letter written on behalf of people who were being treated as though their claims did not exist, and he wrote it because it seemed to him that ignoring injustice when you had a comfortable life was its own kind of moral failure. And Letitia, when he told her about it, took his hand and said, "I would have written the same letter. I am glad you did." The baby came in May of 1875, on a warm morning with light coming through the bedroom window in long amber bars, attended by the midwife from Dusty Creek, a capable woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who had been delivering babies on the Texas frontier for 20 years, and who had an air of calm authority that made the experience feel managed even when it was not calm. It was a boy. He was solid and red-faced and furious about the world from the first moment of his arrival, and he had Edgar's dark hair and Letitia's determined eyes. And Edgar held him in the late morning light while Letitia slept, and Clara stood at the bedroom door looking at the baby with an expression of utter fascination, and he thought that his heart was going to come apart from the sheer capacity of what was in it. They named him James Robert Walden. James for Edgar's father, Robert for Letitia's first husband, a choice that Edgar had suggested and that Letitia had accepted with a gratitude so deep it was beyond words. To keep Robert Conley's name alive in the child of the man who had come after him was not an act of awkwardness or obligation. It was an act of love, for Letitia, for Clara, for the man who had built the ranch and loved this family before Edgar had arrived to continue what he had started. Clara was entirely captivated by James. She approached him with a seriousness of purpose that was both enormously touching and mildly alarming, and she appointed herself his particular guardian with the authority of someone who does not wait to be assigned a role, but simply assumes the most important one available. She told him about the ranch with great thoroughness, daily, as though he were capable of understanding and simply had not been informed yet, and Edgar and Letitia would hear her voice in the evenings from the next room, explaining the cattle operation or the weather patterns of West Texas or the proper way to manage a fence post, to an infant who was almost certainly asleep. "She is going to be extraordinary," Edgar said to Letitia one evening, listening to Clara's voice through the wall. "She already is," Letitia said, without a flicker of parental bias, just as a plain fact. The months that followed James's birth were full in the way that the best years are full, not with crisis or drama, but with the dense, layered richness of a life that has found its shape and is being lived in all its dimensions. The ranch prospered. They expanded the cattle herd in the spring of 1876 with a careful purchase of 6 good animals from a reputable operation 2 counties over, a transaction that Edgar managed, and that made a visible difference in the following autumn's income. They hired a second hand, a young man of 19 named Thomas who was willing and capable, and whom Edgar took on with the same seriousness that Letitia had taken him on 3 years before. Dusty Creek grew during those years, as many small Texas towns were growing in the 1870s, with the railroad bringing new commerce and new families and new ambitions. Edgar became involved in the local cattlemen's association, which Letitia had always been informally connected to, but from which she had been largely excluded in the more formal sense, because of the social structures of the time that regarded women in commerce as anomalies to be accommodated rather than participants to be fully included. Edgar's presence in the formal structure gave him a platform that he used consistently and deliberately to represent the interests of the Conley Walden Ranch, and he made it quietly clear, every time the occasion arose, that Letitia's judgment was the reason the operation was as successful as it was. She told him once that this annoyed her, that she did not need him to speak on her behalf. He told her that he agreed with her completely, and that he had not said anything on her behalf that she had not already said herself, and that what he was doing was making sure the men in the room understood that they needed to listen to her, which was a different thing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is a subtle distinction." "It is a real one," he said. She nodded slowly. "All right, but the day is coming when this particular arrangement will seem absurd to people." "I hope so," Edgar said. "I genuinely hope so." Clara turned 13 in 1875 and 14 in 1876, and with each year she grew more precisely herself, more articulate and more capable and more clear-eyed about the world. She had her mother's directness and her own particular kind of humor, a wit that was sharp enough to be felt and warm enough to be enjoyed, and she was developing strong opinions about justice and education, and the rights of women that she expressed with a clarity that made both Edgar and Letitia realize they were watching someone who was going to do interesting things with her life. She was also, by 14, an excellent horsewoman and a competent ranch hand in her own right, which Edgar had contributed to by teaching her roping as promised, and by including her in the cattle work in ways that were appropriate, and that gave her real skill rather than supervised experience. Letitia had always involved Clara in the ranch's operations seriously, but Edgar's particular contribution was to treat her as a genuine capable person whose abilities were worth investing in, and Clara responded to this with a focused enthusiasm that produced results. The spring of 1877 brought two things of significance. The first was that Letitia was expecting again. She told Edgar on a March morning with the same directness with which she had told him the first time, and he responded with the same encompassing joy. And this time Clara, who was 14 and considerably more worldly in her understanding of these matters than she had been at 11, received the news with a composed pleasure that was entirely her own, without the performative practicality of a younger child. "I would still find a boy interesting," Clara said, "but a girl would also be acceptable." "We will take what we are given and be grateful," Letitia said, with the serenity of a woman who has done this before. The second significant thing was a letter from Missouri. It arrived in April, addressed to Edgar Walden, in a handwriting he did not recognize. Inside was a brief communication from a lawyer in Jefferson City, informing him that a distant uncle, his father's brother, had died without heirs and had left a small estate, consisting primarily of a modest parcel of farmland and a sum of money that the lawyer estimated at approximately $300 after costs. Edgar was named as the sole surviving relative and heir. He sat with the letter for a long time. Letitia read it when he showed her and then sat with it herself. "That is a significant sum," she said. "It is," he said, "and I know exactly what I want to do with it if you agree." She waited. "The east pasture," he said. "We have talked about expanding it for 2 years. If we purchase the adjacent parcel from the Maddox estate, we have room for twice the herd we are currently running. It would require fencing and some water management work, but the land is good. And with the money from Missouri, we could do it without putting the ranch under any financial pressure." She looked at him for a long time with an expression that was, characteristically, more complex than it first appeared. It was thoughtful and warm, and there was something in it that was specifically about him, about who he had shown himself to be. "You came here with nothing," she said. "And the first significant money you have ever had you want to put into this land." "This land is my life," he said simply. "What else would I do with it?" She reached across the table and took his hand. "You are a very good man, Edgar Walden," she said. "I had a very good reason to become one," he said. They purchased the east parcel that summer. Edgar and Thomas spent 3 months fencing it and managing the drainage and integrating it into the existing operation. And by autumn, they had moved a third of the herd onto the new pasture, and the Conley Walden Ranch had become one of the more substantial small cattle operations in that part of Callahan County. The second child was born in October of 1877. She was smaller than James had been, with a quantity of dark hair that seemed improbable for such a small person, and she came into the world with a quiet alertness that made Mrs. Alvarez, the midwife, remark that she had the eyes of someone already forming opinions. They named her Eleanor Rose. James, who was 2.5, investigated his sister with a serious concentration that was a small mirror of his mother's assessing quality, and then announced, "She is very little," with the authority of someone establishing facts. "She is," Edgar agreed. "She can play with me when she is bigger," James said magnanimously, and then he went back to the wooden horse that Edgar had carved for him and seemed to consider the matter settled. Clara held Eleanor with the practiced ease of someone who had been helping with James since he was an infant, and she looked at the small face and said quietly to herself as much as anyone, "Hello, little one. You are going to have a very good life." The years moved the way good years move, with a fullness that makes them feel simultaneously brief and permanent, as though they are happening and already remembered at the same time. James grew into a boy who was energetic and curious, and had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and who followed Edgar around the ranch with an apprentice's serious attention that Edgar found quietly overwhelming. Eleanor grew into a girl with a distinct and emphatic personality, a certainty about her own preferences that expressed itself early and with some force, and a laugh that was so large for her small body that it consistently startled adults who heard it for the first time. Clara, at 16, began talking about education in a way that was clearly more than idle consideration. There was a women's college in San Antonio, and she had written to them, on her own initiative, requesting information about enrollment and requirements, and she showed the letter and the response to Letitia and Edgar one evening after supper with the studied casualness of someone who has already decided what they want and is now going through the formality of asking. They looked at each other over the table. "It is expensive," Clara said, before either of them could speak. "I know that. I have thought about that. I am willing to work. I can contribute. And I know the ranch needs me, and I would not go until I was 17 at the earliest, and I would come back after and." "Clara," Letitia said. Clara stopped. "We are going to send you," Letitia said. "That was never in question. We will find the money." Clara blinked, the composed control of her face breaking briefly into something much younger and more openly joyful. "Really? You are the most intelligent person on this ranch," Edgar said, "and possibly in this county. We would be fools to prevent you from becoming what you are clearly meant to become." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you, Papa." Edgar, who had been called Papa by her for several years now, and who still felt it in the same central place every single time, simply nodded. In 1879, when Clara was 15.5, she began in earnest preparing for enrollment the following year. Edgar tutored her in mathematics, which was her weaker subject, and Letitia worked with her on composition and literature, and together they ensured that she arrived at the Women's College in San Antonio in the autumn of 1880 as well prepared as a young woman from a Texas cattle ranch could be, which turned out to be considerably better prepared than the institution expected. The morning they put her on the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Clara embraced her mother for a long time and then turned to Edgar and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes that were her mother's and entirely her own, and said, "You gave me a real home and a real education and a real future. I want you to know that I know that." Edgar hugged her, the way he had learned to hug her over the years, firmly and completely, without the awkward half-measure of a man uncertain of his place in a child's life, because he had long since stopped being uncertain of it. "You did the real work," he said. "We just kept the fences up." She laughed, the sharp, warm laugh, and she got on the stagecoach, and Letitia leaned against Edgar's arm as they watched it pull away down the main road of Dusty Creek, and he felt her take a slow, steadying breath. "She is going to be magnificent," he said. "She already is," Letitia said for the second time in exactly the same tone with exactly the same certainty. James, who was 5, looked up at both of them from the height of 5 years old and said, "Is Clara coming back?" "Yes," they both said together. "Good," James said. "She owes me a game of checkers." They drove home on the buckboard in the autumn morning, Alina asleep between them with her head on Letitia's lap, James sitting on Edgar's other side watching the plains with the focused attention of a boy who considers the world his particular business to understand, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, golden and vast and theirs. That evening, after the children were in bed, Letitia and Edgar sat on the porch in the cool October air, the same porch where he had kissed her for the first time 6 years ago, and the stars were as implausible and abundant as they always were over the Texas plain, and she put her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her. "Do you ever think about the man who rode in here in 1873, she said, "with no prospects and a tired horse?" "Sometimes," he said. "He seems very far away." "He does," she said, "and yet he is the reason everything that followed is possible. You are the reason," he said, "all of it. You were here first. You built this." "We built it," she said with the quiet firmness she used when she was correcting something she considered important. "We built it. You just needed to arrive." He pressed his lips to her temple. "I am very glad I arrived." She turned her face up and looked at him in the dark, the way she had looked at him across fences and kitchen tables and cattle pastures for the better part of a decade, with those dark, direct eyes that could read him the way she read weather that had read him, he sometimes thought, from the first moment she looked up from mending that fence rail and found him at her gate. "I am glad, too," she said, "more than I know how to say, and you know that I am a woman who generally knows how to say things." "You said it," he said. "You say it all the time. You just say it in fence posts and spring calves and tutoring sessions and the way you kept my coffee hot on cold mornings before I was awake to ask for it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very romantic thing to say." "I have been practicing for years," he said. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the night was soft and full, and the land around them was quiet and safe, and theirs together in every way that mattered, legally and practically, and above all, in the way that is not recorded in county documents but is written in something more permanent than paper. The years continued to unfold with the generous logic of a life that has found its footing. James grew into himself with a steadiness that was deeply Edgar's and a precision of expression that was purely Letitia's. And by the time he was 7, he was doing real work on the ranch, small work but genuine, and taking it seriously with an investment that made Edgar realize he was watching the next generation of this land beginning to form its relationship with it. Alina, at 4, was a considerable personality in a small frame, with opinions about everything from the names of the cattle to the appropriateness of having supper before the horses were watered, which she considered the wrong order of priorities. She adored her father with a devoted intensity that Letitia found both touching and mildly amusing, and she followed him on his rounds of the property with the determination of someone who will not be left behind under any circumstances. He taught her the names of the cattle and the names of the wildflowers that grew in the pasture margins, and she stored this information with the earnest thoroughness of a child for whom the world is a series of important things that must be understood. Thomas, the young man Edgar had hired in 1876, had by now grown into a fully competent ranch hand and an honest and reliable part of the operation. And in 1881, he married a woman from Dusty Creek named Ruth, who was cheerful and capable, and who became, over time, something like family to them in the comfortable way that the best employees become, through shared history and mutual respect and years of working the same land. Clara came home from San Antonio in 1882 with a teaching certificate and a quiet intensity about her that was new, refined, the particular quality of someone who has been in the world and thought hard about it. She was 18, tall and direct, with her mother's bearing and her own particular earned confidence. And she came home the way people come home when home is real, not as a retreat but as a return to something central. She sat at the kitchen table with Edgar and Letitia on her first evening home and talked for 3 hours about the college and the women she had met there, and the books she had read and the conversations she had had about the way the world was arranged, and the way she thought it could be better arranged. And Edgar and Letitia listened with the engaged attention of people who had been waiting for this conversation and were ready for all of it. She was going to teach. She had already spoken to the school board in Dusty Creek, and there was a position available for the coming year. She would teach in Dusty Creek near her family, near the land she had grown up on, and she would do the work she had decided was hers to do. "I am proud of you," Letitia said when Clara had finished. "So am I," Edgar said, profoundly. Clara looked at them both with the dry, loving appreciation that was characteristic of her. "You made this possible," she said, "both of you, together. And I want you to know that I understand that fully and completely, and that I am grateful for it every single day." Letitia reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. Edgar covered Letitia's hand with his. The three of them sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, the table around which so much of their shared life had been worked out, in the house that Robert Conley had built, and that Edgar Walden had come to maintain, and that Letitia had kept alive through sheer will and love. And the house was full of the sound of James reading aloud in the next room to Eleanor, who was demanding that he read the part about the horse again, more loudly, with feeling. Clara listened to her siblings and smiled. "The horse again," she said. "Eleanor has been interested in horses for 3 years," Letitia said. "It does not diminish." "I wonder where she gets it," Edgar said, looking at Letitia. "I have no idea what you mean," Letitia said, with perfect composure. Clara laughed, and her parents laughed with her, and the evening went on in the warm and generous way of evenings that are living proof of everything you worked for. The autumn of 1882 settled over the Conley Walden Ranch with the particular beauty that the Texas plains produce in October, the grasses going gold and russet, the sky taking on that deep, saturated blue that belongs specifically to high autumn, the mornings sharp and the afternoons mild, the cattle moving through the pastures with the unhurried ease of animals that have enough. One afternoon in the middle of October, Edgar rode out alone to the east pasture, the one they had purchased with the Missouri inheritance in 1877, and he sat on Bess, who was older now but still steady and strong, and he looked out over the land that stretched from the fence line to the far horizon. The grass was long and dry, and it moved in the afternoon breeze like something breathing, and the cattle were calm and fat, and in the far distance he could see the roofline of the farmhouse and a thin line of smoke from the kitchen chimney, and he could just make out a small figure at the gate of the south paddock that he thought, from the set of the shoulders, was Letitia. He had come to this frontier with nothing but a name and a horse. He had ridden in on a Tuesday in autumn with 4 years of drifting behind him and no particular destination ahead of him, and the mare's hooves sending up dust on a road he had never traveled before. And Harold Finch had drawn him a map on a piece of wrapping paper and sent him 3 miles east, and there had been a woman mending a fence rail with a hammer in the late afternoon light. He had nothing when he arrived. He was not nothing. He had never been nothing. He had his character and his hands and his willingness to work hard and his capacity for love, which had simply been waiting for somewhere to go. But in terms of the material evidence of a life, he had had very little. A name, a horse, the clothes on his back and $12 in his pocket and the worn-out remnant of hope that the next place might be the place, and she had given him every reason to stay. Not by asking him to stay, not by performing any particular act of kindness designed to retain him, but by being exactly who she was, the woman who met his gaze at the fence with brown eyes that missed nothing, who shook his hand like a rancher, who said plainly what she meant and meant exactly what she said, who loved her daughter with a fierceness that was complete, who stood at her fence in the evenings like she owned the sky, who had grief in her and strength in her and humor in her, and the particular, irreplaceable quality of someone who is fully and authentically themselves, which is rarer and more valuable than any other human quality, and which he had recognized at some level from the first moment, and had been walking toward ever since. She had given him the ranch and the work and the belonging. She had given him Clara, whom he loved with all the wholeness of paternal love, which is not diminished by not being biological. She had given him James and Alina, and the particular daily miracle of watching small people grow into themselves. She had given him a home, not just a structure but the actual thing, the warmth and the permanence and the place in the world that a man needs and does not always find. She had given him, most of all, herself, which was the most extraordinary thing because she was the most extraordinary thing. He turned the mare and rode back toward the farmhouse. Letitia was at the south paddock fence, as he had thought, not mending it this time but simply standing with her arms resting on the top rail, looking out at the herd in the golden afternoon light. He dismounted and tied Bess to the post and came to stand beside her. She did not look at him. She was smiling slightly at the cattle or the afternoon or some private thought, and the smile was the real one, the full one, the one he had been working to produce for 9 years and which still felt like an achievement every time it appeared. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," he said. He leaned his arms on the fence beside hers, their shoulders touching the way they had stood for years, in the easy physical shorthand of two people who have shared enough space and enough time to know instinctively how to inhabit the same place. The cattle moved through the pasture in the amber light. The smoke from the kitchen chimney drifted in the clear sky. Somewhere inside the house, Alina's voice rose in the emphatic way it rose when she had something important to communicate, followed by James's patient response, followed by Clara's voice laying down some kind of judgment that appeared to settle the matter. "Full house," Edgar said. "Always," Letitia said. She turned and looked at him, and he looked at her. And 9 years was in the look. 9 years of fences and cattle and hard winters and good harvests and children growing and love growing alongside them. Tended and cultivated with the same steady daily care that you give to anything you mean to keep alive. And it had grown into something that was not the urgent, breathless thing of early feeling but something deeper and more lasting. The kind of love that is also a home, that is also a partnership. That is also a friendship that holds all of it at once and is not diminished by any of it but enlarged by all of it. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything important, plainly and precisely and with complete intention. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since I watched you mend a fence rail with a hammer and you did not look up when you heard me coming." "I looked up," she said. "I simply did not show it until I was ready." "That is entirely consistent with your character," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had that Christmas night in 1873 when everything between them had begun to be said out loud, and he put his arm around her, and the afternoon went on in its wide and generous way, the sky enormous above them, the land theirs beneath their feet, the house behind them full of their children's voices, and nothing left unresolved, nothing left undone, nothing left open that they had not closed together, carefully and well. The bay mare, Bess, who had carried Edgar Walden across Missouri and Kansas and into Texas, who had walked him down the road into Dusty Creek on a Tuesday in autumn, and stood at the hitching post outside the general store, while he ate bread on the porch, and thought about what Harold Finch had told him about a woman 3 miles east who was holding a ranch together alone, who had carried him through the gate and across the yard to the place where his life was waiting for him. Stood at the paddock fence in the afternoon sun with her head down in the patient way of old horses, and the golden light lay across everything like a benediction, like an answer, like the last page of something that had been worth every word. James came through the kitchen door and ran across the yard with the unrestrained energy of a 7-year-old who has just discovered that supper is almost ready and there is still time to be outside. And he ran to the paddock fence and climbed the rails and sat on the top board and looked out over the land with his father's eyes and his mother's expression. And he said, to no one in particular and to the whole of the golden afternoon, "This is really good." Edgar looked at Letitia. Letitia looked at Edgar. "Yes," they said together, without hesitation, without qualification, without anything left to add. It was.